Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast exploring topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, always with the underlying question of how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship, presently and across time, human and non-human alike. And as per usual, I have a little overture that I'm going to read to you to introduce the episode, its contents, and its context. And you can read along at jameswjesser.com in the show notes for this episode, episode 170. The journey of bringing psilocybin therapy to the masses continues, and the complexities of doing so as a retreat business without being contorted away from your ethos by the economic force of the modern corporate world, while also maintaining the capacity to provide safe, positive, and effectively healing experiences for your guests, is the topic of this episode of the podcast. Specifically, we feature an interview with Justin Townsend of MycoMeditations, a psilocybin retreat center in Jamaica, and not only about the business side of running this retreat center in the booming but still burgeoning psychedelic therapy industry, but we also talk about the nuances of his team's therapeutic framework for group-facilitated psilocybin therapeutics in natural contexts. And here's a little bit more about Justin Townsend. Throughout his career, he has worked as a business leader across a range of industries, helping innovative companies identify opportunities, communicate their vision, and deliver profitable products. He has also been on a personal quest to explore alternative healing therapies to combat his own anxiety and depression. Over the past 20 years, Justin has delved into both transpersonal and Jungian depth psychology, explored psychedelic modes of healing, and developed meditation and breathwork techniques, which he taught in Germany. After attending a private retreat with MycoMeditations in 2017, he saw the opportunity to combine his unique business skills with his interest in alternative healing methods, whereby Justin joined the MycoMeditations team soon afterwards, becoming a partner and CEO in 2019. So there are sort of two brackets that Justin is on the show to talk about today. It's almost like you could say there are two sides of this conversation. The first side is the business of running a successful psilocybin retreat center in the economic context of the modern corporate world, and doing so without losing your ethics in the process. The other side of the conversation is the therapeutic framework and philosophy that MycoMeditations holds for their retreats and their guests. There's almost like a hard dividing line that the first half of the conversation is business, the second half is therapeutics, with a little bit of sort of an echo to the business side at the very end. Look at the timestamps for this episode wherever you're checking it out if you'd like to skip one or the other. So some of the things we cover on that business side of the conversation is Justin's journey from the corporate world to running a psychedelic retreat center, psychopathology in the corporate world and how good people end up doing bad things, the nuances around running a successfully financial psychedelic retreat center without ethical sacrifices, what it means to be building what they call the, quote, gold standard for group-facilitated psilocybin therapeutics in natural settings, end quote, data propriety, as well as their sense of where they fit inside of the process of supporting peer-reviewed research around psychedelics and psychedelic therapy. In the other half of the conversation, we explore why MycoMeditations holds an entirely, quote, non-shamanic framework for their psilocybin work, how to support someone who has a beyond Western framework experience from a non-shamanic perspective, helping to prevent post-psychedelic hypomania from evolving into psychosis, differentiating between psychosis and a, quote, normal psychomemetic response, end quote, non-pharmacological interventions for psychosis, and the psychomimetic response in general, as well as the golden shadow and the dangers of golden shadow projection in not only psychedelic therapy, but spiritual communities. So that's the overture and a little taste of the content we're going to explore in this episode with Justin Townsend. I hope you enjoy it. Before we get into it, a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking it out. Those people give substantially, but a big thank you to all of my patrons nonetheless, because This is my full-time work, and your voluntary contribution allows me to give myself to this work in a way that is not beholden to statistics or advertisers, but can just be a general expression of my curiosity and interest in relationship with you, while also literally helping me to pay my bills. So very much, thank you very much. If you're not yet a patron or you'd like to support the show, links are in the description to do so. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the outro to this episode. Now, one final, I think, important piece before the interview begins, and I haven't said this before because I felt like it, goes without saying, but it doesn't go without saying. So I'm going to say it, which is that simply because I have a person on the show does not necessarily mean that I am personally endorsing or recommending their services. I have them on the show because I'm interested in giving a showcase to their ideas because I find them valuable in some way or another. Maybe not necessarily that I find them exclusively correct, but I find the conversation could be valuable and the ideas could be valuable to share into the culture space. Now, that isn't me not recommending one person or one retreat center over another, nor is it explicitly recommending it unless I'm explicitly saying I recommend it. So this comment isn't necessary to say yay or nay to MycoMeditations. At the end of this conversation, you'll make that decision however you feel is appropriate for you based on your conversations, based on what you heard here today, as well as hopefully some further research into ensuring that they align with what you're looking for and what you need as a safe and effective retreat center. But I feel like I need to say that because I didn't realize I need to say it, but I do, and here I am. And I'll say it pretty much every time from here on in as well. So it's not specific to MycoMeditations. But yeah, that is said. And here we are at the end of the intro and the beginning of this interview with Justin Townsend here on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 170. Enjoy. Justin Townsend, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you, James. A pleasure to be here.
So people listening, if they didn't skip the intro, already heard your bio. But what's not in your bio is sort of like a deeper look at how you came to be where you are with MycoMeditations. And I'd like to start there to give us a sense of the arc of your story that brought you to MycoMeditations, to sort of contextualize to people how one comes to be, like running a retreat center for psilocybin mushrooms, but also sort of where the perspective on some of the other topics I'll ask you about later is coming from. And so why don't you give us a sort of like general overview of your story? Not too much granularity here. If there's anything that I feel like, actually, let me ask you further deep diving questions on it. I'll do so because I want to leave a lot of extra space for the other questions I have. But why don't you start us off with your story?
Certainly. Well, I'm certainly not your typical psychedelic practitioner in the way that I came into this. A lot of people are coming into it these days from the mental health perspective, and so my corporate career, for which I'm predominantly known, has been over 25 years working at the intersection of startup companies and venture capital. But that wasn't something you'd ever find on my LinkedIn profile until a few years ago. It would not have been safe for me to come out, if you like, and announce that I work with psychedelics. So how that began is a difficult childhood with anxiety and chronic depression. Started working with mushrooms just purely recreationally in my teens, scared myself a few times doing that, but also noticed that I was getting quite substantial relief from my depression and anxiety. So had an on-off relationship with psychedelics for that time. At one point in my life, I moved to Germany. There I worked to learn a form of holotropic breath work. I spent 2 years learning it, spent a bit of time teaching it, and then I was invited to start facilitating 4-day-long holotropic breathwork retreats. That meant working with a lot of people as they were working through their repressed emotional material. In 2001, a friend came back from an ayahuasca retreat in Holland and said, "Hey, you've got to try this." I did. I felt at the time it was necessary because my meditation practice had somewhat plateaued. I didn't feel like I was moving forward as I should do in life or could do in life. And I had my first ayahuasca experience and went on to have a number of other ayahuasca experiences, primarily part of the European Psychedelic Underground Network. Okay. as I got to know the organizations back then, over 20 years ago, that were doing this, they were not well heeled financially. They were not well organized. They were bringing in shamans, medicine men, medicine women from South America, Central America, hosting them, flying them in, paying for accommodation to venues we would use. And so they were running into money issues and asked for help. And I said, I will help out indeed, but in return, teach me everything you know. And so that became obviously nothing at all comparable to the typical lineage of an ayahuasquero and their ongoing development. This was piecemeal here and there, working quite a few ayahuasca retreats. And then fast forward, 2017, I came to MycoMeditations on a private retreat, got to know the founder reasonably well back then. But I must say that MycoMeditations back in 2017 was still very much the wild, wild west. It had begun in 2015. And I became an advisor to the company. And so back then, it was, I wouldn't call it a therapeutic model. It also wasn't a recreational model either. We didn't really have protocols and standards for how we do things. And so over time, I joined the company and moved from an advisor role to an owner. And then the original founder left 2 or 3 years ago. And I took the company over as the CEO. And here I find myself today, I think sometimes more by luck than by judgment, running a leading psychedelic center in Jamaica. The one difference here that I would say is that prior to MycoMeditations, most of my career-driven decisions were very focused and optimized along the way. I was driving towards a certain position I wanted in my career. But with MycoMeditations, it very much all just seemed to unfold naturally around me. It all evolved very, very naturally, and the right people came along, the right situations came along, and it just felt very much like the natural and right thing to do, the right kind of progression for me.
So that career that you were like very focused on, very directive, very sort of like, I guess, in the sort of like controlling rather than trusting the universal flow or something. And there must have been some sort of, balance there, but that was in a corporate realm. And I think it's easy for a lot of people. And I think this is actually quite fair for there to be a kind of stereotype where people coming from the corporate world moving into the psychedelic industry are basically people who see it as a place to make good money. They've had a handful of psychedelic experiences. Maybe they've been to Burning Man a couple of times, or maybe they've done ayahuasca a bunch of times. But either way, they're like mostly just corporate people living in corporate or tech culture that are like sort of moving in with a sort of a grandeur that it was like that it's going to be good money, or that they have this capacity perhaps that they really don't have. But what I'm hearing you say is that it was almost as though, like, I'm thinking about the astrological sort of sun and moon, so like your solar sign or sun sign is like your outward facing expression, and your lunar sign is sort of like your inner being. It's almost as though you are living, for a long time where your sort of outward expression in the world was very much in the corporate field, in your career and et cetera, while in the background you were doing all this deep psychedelic work until all of a sudden all that deep psychedelic work put you in a position where all that corporate work you were doing assisted your ability to step into something, I'm assuming, that feels more in alignment with your deeper self. Does that sound about right? Like, did I characterize that well?
Very well indeed. The corporate world for me was more like I was good at it, but it was very robotic and going through the motions. But at the same time, I felt like a square peg in a round hole. Extremely sensitive, good at having my corporate persona. In many respects, it made me a good manager or a good leader as I worked my way through up positions and led companies. But it was hard when, where the rubber hits the road in the corporate world and venture capital-backed companies. There's a distinct difference in the type of personalities that you're dealing with there. And there are a lot of sociopathic, psychopathic traits. And certainly I had my fair share of soul-destroying run-ins with both individuals and corporations that seem to operate in that manner as well. Especially as I think that if the leadership of a company brings their own, say, unhealthy psychological blueprint to the leadership of the company, that will percolate down across all layers eventually as well, right? So I'd certainly been in the mill, I'd been in the ring, with quite a few corporations were like that, and it was draining, and it was exhausting, and it was leaving me very empty and hollow.
Mm-hmm. So what do you feel now that you're, I guess this is like a twofold question. I'll give them both to you and let you pick how you want to approach them. One of them is, is there anything, I'm assuming there's at least something, is there anything about your behavior or how you identified yourself in this act in the corporate world that your psychedelic experience sort of woke up to you as being something worthy of maybe guilt or remorse and called you to make shifts in your life as a consequence, behaviors, et cetera, that you were expressing, perhaps called to express as a consequence of the context of your corporate work, but like anything that came up that you're like, whoa, actually, like this is not an okay way to be in the world, and psychedelics expose that to you. The second question is, and maybe they're the same question, is there anything now working at MycoMeditations that you thought was like, okay, like I learned in the business world, we're going to apply that business corporate work to like this scenario. We're going to help make this business function. Of course, you had all this background in psychedelic work and supporting and all this kind of stuff. So that aside, but something about how you thought you were going to need to run a company for its successfulness, that once you got to MycoMeditations, you were like, whoa, that's not going to fly here. I need to change the way that I'm showing up for this in order to continue to hold the ideals of the psychedelic work, maybe the lunar work here, even as I'm trying to practice being a CEO of a company that is, fingers crossed, going to be successful. So maybe that's a bit too much, but those are the two questions. I'll let you approach them how you feel.
So one of the, I consider myself to have a high degree of integrity, but that wasn't always the case. Okay. Integrity was something that I had to learn the hard way. You develop it over time. You learn by
that way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But when you're surrounded in a corporate world, which is venture capital backed, and you're building a company specifically to be sold within a 4 to 5 year time frame, you hire and fire in line with that. Integrity and ethics will absolutely be challenged. There's a very famous saying in the venture capital world: never get in between a venture capitalist and their exit. So, the venture capitalists and the board members will have warm, kind, seemingly relationships with you and want to encourage you as their fresh young CEO. But, when it comes time to growing the company to a different level, if you're not the right person for it, there can be decisions along the way that you're surrounded by people that are all willing to sacrifice their integrity to make a buck, and you're kind of being expected to go along for the ride. And it takes some courage to stand up and say, I'm sorry, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go along with that. So for me, the one foundational principle that I've applied throughout all of my adult life is about integrity and interpersonal reactions. And the underlying quote I'd say is that the softest pillow to sleep on at night is a clear conscience. And I've known what it's like in my past to sleep on a pillow that wasn't a clear conscience. And that frankly fueled my anxiety and my depression. And I wasn't able to look at myself in the mirror in the mornings. Now, not that I've done anything that dastardly, but the accumulative effect over time of unfulfilled promises, half-kept promises, short-term gains, eradicating long-term benefit, all this kind of just builds and builds and builds over time. So I was realizing anyway, the further I got into my corporate career, those demands would never kind of go away. I'd always be surrounded by, if I was going to take external investment into a company, those demands would always be made upon me because, again, never get in the way of a venture capitalist in their exit. With a big difference, of course, is if you're the CEO founder of your own company, you're placing a bet on one company. It's your company, right? A venture capitalist who's invested and has a position on your board is invested into 10 to 15 or 20 other companies in the same area as you, or complementary areas. They can afford for a few companies to fail. It's part of how they calculate their return on investment for their portfolio. When you're the young CEO and this is your bet and this is your single ride, you're going to make it or lose it. It's a different set of decisions that you have to make in a different set of circumstances. So I think integrity is a very difficult thing to maintain in the corporate environment. So that's that side of things.
So if I can make a quick pause, like some a phrasing that I heard. I think I actually heard it through either Rebel Wisdom or some other likened podcast, was something to the effect that like there's a lot of sort of psychopaths in the corporate world because it really, there's a real that sort of disposition really fits in that world, but that most people aren't. And yet they still act as though they are. And the reason is that they're being incentivized into psychopathic behaviors by psychopathic institutions that are founded on a race to the bottom kind of mentality, which is like, oh, if we don't cheapen and extort, we're going to lose out on the business that is going to cheapen and extort. And we need to, because of our investors or because this, because that, we have to do that. And so it's this race to the bottom. So like hearing you talk about your personal experience, I feel like this sort of conception I've heard elsewhere feels affirmed through your anecdote.
Yeah, and I'd say also is that workplaces are full of people with varying mental health issues and concerns. Look at the parenting style. Were they raised by an authoritarian parent, an authoritative parent, a neglectful parent, a dismissive or indulgent parent? That all impacts how they develop into adults. The parenting style, what's their attachment disorder in romantic and even business relationships, who's depressed, who's anxious, who's neurotic. All of that just kind of feeds into the whole global sort of company mess that just kind of is a breeding ground for these people with sociopathic and psychopathic traits to take advantage. Because let's face it, right? If you take somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder, they're very charismatic. They're very used to learning your vulnerabilities and building trust and love bombing you. And then once they've gained your trust, they know your vulnerabilities, they're going to exploit that. So whether that's a romantic relationship or a corporate environment, that is just fairly consistent all over the place. I don't want to come across as too cynical. There are lots of good people with high ideals and good integrity, but anticipate that integrity being challenged all the time within the corporate environment.
As a consequence, I assume, of the sort of higher order, the high context of what it is to thrive economically in our larger sort of the conditions and the structures of our socioeconomic systems globally, like that high context sort of bleeds down into sort of like each different nested expression of a relational or a business community context, even that the community is a work community. And so there's certain things that are required in order for a business to get to a certain place inside of a larger system. And increasingly those things that are required will bleed down all the way into the one-to-one human interactions in the workplace.
Exactly. Yeah. And somebody that I follow and listen to a lot is a guy called Jamie Wheel, the founder of the Genome Project. He talks about the multipolar trap. And the example he gives for the multipolar trap is, imagine you're in a room full of people. There's a plate that was full of biscuits, and now there's one left. Everybody's gathered around. Who's going to go for the last biscuit? With the mentality being, we all have high integrity, but somebody's going to go for it. It may as well be me. I may as well be the asshole, and I'm the one that lunges in and grabs that last biscuit off the plate before anybody else does. That mentality. So a lot of companies can virtue signal their high ethics and their diversity and all these things they're doing in the world. But when it comes down to the hard business decisions, those values and that integrity will often be sacrificed in the rush to get the biscuit and get the profit before anybody else does. We see that commonly within organizations. That's reflected very well.
And to be fair, I think, like I even see it in myself. I think we all see it in ourselves at times too. Like, for example, I mean, I'm literally ashamed to say this, but there have been times, and probably will be times again, where I end up having to just completely throw out an entirely perfect reusable Tupperware container because I took entirely perfectly fine good food and let it rot for so long in the fridge because I was too lazy to clean it that I didn't even want to open it up. I just threw it out completely, and probably had to throw it out completely anyways because I let it damaged, even though I know that is a not having created that situation would have been an act of caring for the ecological consequences of my actions as a consumer. And yet sometimes I still do that because in the long run, it was easier for me not to think about it or to so on and so forth. And it's amazing because that feels so minor, and yet I feel so much shame to admit that, actually. So, but also I feel like I can see how that multipolar trap sort of comes down even into these sort of like seemingly normal interactions in our homes and with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that the concept is that one individual will do something to benefit themselves to the detriment of the collective, kind of thing. So yeah, very much so.
Cool. Well, now that I've revealed my deepest, darkest shame,
I'm sure they're not. You've got more books to write yet, my friend.
Okay. So one of them is now out. There was the second question that you were about to step into.
Right. So, having been in the workforce since the late 1980s, I've been through multiple recessions. The first one or two I went through was very distressing for me. A lot of uncertainty, financial insecurity, learning to steer companies through difficult times like that. And you have to make the hard decisions to lay people off, create skeleton staffs, restructure the organizations, and all this type of thing. And also having built quite a few companies from scratch, from the ground up, or gone in very early to a young management company and helped them develop further. I brought that business expertise and sense to MycoMeditations. So, it was about putting processes into place. It was putting accountability into place, putting a reporting organizational hierarchy into place, clear lines of reporting roles and responsibilities, implementing systems from booking software through to clinical tracking software, but all things that we did over time just to make the company more stable and run more efficiently. But I always knew that where MycoMeditations needed to be was pretty much where it is now, quite a way to go from where it was in 2017 to where we get to now. So certainly all that business experience has helped me steer the ship. And I think it's safe to say that anybody can captain a ship in a calm storm, but it's not until you've got a big storm coming. Sorry, I should start again. It's safe to say that anybody can captain a ship in calm weather, but it's not until the big storm comes in that you really get tested as the captain of the ship or the leader. Do you respond with stress and anger that spreads out to the rest of your workforce, or are you the calm, confident leader that says, yes, we recognize this is a bit of a destabilizing process, there's uncertainty, but here's how we're going to get through it, and lead in that kind of way. So having been through quite a few crises in my career, both personal and corporate, and withstood and come through those crises and out the other side and learned from them, that certainly helped us in this very nascent psychedelic industry with the challenges that we faced as a company, and certainly through COVID as well. I mean, it's, trying to build a quality leading company in a nascent psychedelic space where we're surrounded by competition, either looking to diminish what we do or looking to replicate what we do, is not easy. There's a lot of expense that we or investment that we make into the company constantly to maintain the high standards and how we want to position ourselves. So one of the things I decided was I'm never going to take money from a venture capitalist, because that's not something that I want sitting on my shoulder dictating how I should run the company. Not just from the perspective of the difference in the values, but from a variety of other different respects, from having taken external venture capital before. And so this leaves me with the freedom to run the company how I want it to be run. And I live and die by the sword and the decisions that we make in getting to where we have got today and where we're going to get to in the future as well.
So I think this sort of discussion of the corporate meeting, the psychedelic world side, is slowly drawing to a close. Well, one question I have is, what is the overall, okay, sorry, this is a double layer question. One of which is, I'm asking you about the intention. One of which is about the company. I'm going to specifically mention something that you brought up in our call. But before that, I'm wondering, what is your overall intention with this company, in the sense that it sounds like you're taking a lot of care for ensuring that it is a successful company, but also a successful retreat center for the people involved receiving the psilocybin, the mushrooms. Any company is subject to any changes that any new owner or CEO wants to undergo, unless there's legal protection against that. I know other psychedelic companies, one in general or one in specific, that has shifted the business model to a what's it called, like a steward ownership, wherein the values and the ethics of the company cannot be changed, even if it comes under other ownership later, in order to have the establishing values and ethos of the company protected moving forward. Is that on mind for you? Excuse me. Is that on your mind? Like, do you consider the impact of what might happen if and when you leave this company? Is that something you're protecting for? Another question is it something that you're looking to do later to sell the company? I mean, maybe you wouldn't say that if there's some sort of strategy in place, but that's the question now for you.
Yeah. Well, let me answer the question from the end. Is that I'm not building this company to sell it. Okay. Yes, of course, when you're running a company, you want to be healthy, you want to be profitable, but not at any cost, and certainly not at the cost of our guest outcomes and the well-being of our staff, and compensating them well and looking after them well as well. So it was never my intention to build a company to sell it. And I hadn't actually thought about any kind of event in the future, to be frank with you, James, where I wouldn't be the CEO and somebody else would be coming in. So I've not built in any preventative mechanisms around conscious stewardship that would kick in, if you like, or get triggered in the event of an acquisition or something like that.
Sure. Or, in the event of your untimely death, because turns out that could be any time, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just putting that in consideration.
So within, there is this stewardship model is nestled within a wider concept of conscious capitalism. Okay. But I do not think that no matter what legalese is in place, that there aren't workarounds for those that want to create a workaround for that. I'm a little bit wary of the stewardship model. I don't know enough about it. I know at the end of the day that from the corporate world, if you want to attract and retain really good people, they're going to grow the company, and that profit then gets redistributed into all the employees as a profit share in some way. Okay. If somebody wants to build a company that's going to be successful, you've got to look after your leadership well, right? And the people that support them in the hierarchy below them. And I think if there are limitations on how you compensate the leadership and the employees of any company, as in only so much profit can go out, only so much of a bonus, you're going to limit your ability to attract and retain good leadership. Sometimes when I'm working with startup companies, I have to explain to them that you were the right person to found this. You were a great CEO to go from $0 to $5 million in revenue, but you've never taken a company from $5 to $50 million in revenue. That's a different skill set. You don't have it. We've got to look outside the company and bring somebody in with that skill set. Now, if there are candidates out there that habitually successfully grow companies from the $5 million to $50 million revenue and have a track record of doing so, that's who you're looking for, and that comes at a certain cost. And whilst I believe there are people out there that will do it for the cause and for the right reasons and not so much for the financial or other compensation, at the end of the day, these existing candidates tend to all have big houses and expensive households and 2 or 3 cars and another spare house that has to be maintained. So I'm not denying that there are those candidates out there, but I think the pool that you're fishing in to find those candidates is very, very small, and that would subsequently impact the leadership quality of the company as well. I'm just thinking on my feet here.
Yeah, let me, and fair enough. Let me sort of, I want to get clarification on something, because something there felt a bit weird, because if I think about, and maybe this is my ignorance, if I think about who are the people that are able to take a $5 million company to a $50 million company, and how do they run that company, my assumption is that they're likely running it in the same way that you just spoke to previously was part of what made you feel like you weren't sleeping on that soft pillow some nights. So with respect to the company you're trying to build from the ethos of the therapy you're providing, realistically, could you actually find someone who's going to be able to take it from a 5 million to a 50 million without jeopardizing the actual values of the company? Because I can't imagine psychedelic therapy being something that can make that kind of money without taking the kind of actions that says, all right, you're out, you're out, you're out, you're out. That's being deprioritized. This is prioritized. Marketing up. Okay, quality control down. You know, like these kinds of things to sort of like ramp the finances up. So in that respect, you know, like you might be fishing from a really small pool, but does it not make sense to be fishing the highest quality fish out of the small pool, rather the most nutritious fish from the small pool than trying to get the biggest fish from wherever you can? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It absolutely does. But I ask you to think about the psychedelic industry as a whole, not just a therapeutic end where the rubber hits the road, from the biopharma to the cultivation to the GMP to the therapy, say post-trip integration, to the training companies. Many companies are going to require exactly these types of individuals, and there won't be enough of them to go around, assuming that they can be found. So
wait, these individuals, as in like the big money individuals, or these individuals as the ones that accord with the ethos?
That one.
The latter.
Those
okay.
ones. Yeah. And neither have I seen conscious stewardship models with any longevity as yet. They've not come to their
as of
fruition.
Yet.
Yeah, we haven't seen a full couple of cycles, or they've been around for 10, 15, 20 years, worked out the loose ends, refined themselves, have proven to themselves and the industry around them that this is a working model. And I am familiar with a couple of the conscious stewardship models within the psychedelic space, where on the exterior, all is rosy, but on the interior, nowhere near as rosy, because they are facing this disconnect. And they're seeing that whatever limitations or perceived benefits that arise out of the conscious stewardship model, not as easy to implement when you're dealing with the average human condition that's got a mortgage to pay and 2 screaming kids at their feet and maybe a nagging spouse, right? Who knows?
Sure. The average human condition within our present socioeconomic context, because my anticipation is that people would be different if we didn't all have to like struggle to make ends meet, or struggle to compensate for whatever void we have in ourselves by dominating and succeeding at like great extent over others. So just want to put that, and because eventually we're going to get down to that kind of therapeutic stuff. And so we can't forget, like you said, there's a lot of mental health issues that are inside any business or any community. So, yeah.
I mean, do I believe that there's some ill-defined gray utopia out there in the corporate world that we'll get to? Maybe in 100 or 200 years, I don't know. I don't think it's in the near term. But we have to deal with the right now and the messiness of the right now and these contrasting values. But it is great to see the amount of people that do have integrity and do have high values working in the psychedelic space. They definitely exist. There's plenty of them here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And understandable, high quality generally means high cost, right? And so you do have to have, there's a certain balance between like making money and profiting enough so to sustain a high quality business, which includes high quality on every level, which includes high quality facilitators, which means well-paid, happy, balanced, not economically disparaged employees, right? So I kind of see that I can see the sort of line that you're trying to walk here, and I don't envy you in that respect.
Thank you.
So let's let that slide for a second, because one of the things I heard you say, let me just take a look at my notes here, and then after this, I want to get into asking you about some of the practicalities of running your company with respect to handling your clients, participants. So one of the things you said in your own words, at least I'm paraphrasing, is that you're working to have MycoMeditations producer become a kind of gold standard for group facilitated psilocybin therapeutics in natural setting. So before we start going into what that actually looks like on the ground, what is that vision for you and why?
Okay. Part of it is a deep desire to do this very well and to create the best outcomes for all of our guests in a reasonably efficient way. Okay. Part of it is also a recognizance that when the US federal government somehow blesses psilocybin and MDMA, that there will be a set of standards that are going to be imposed, okay, a certain set of licensure, regulation, and standards. But until that happens, it's a bit like the wild, wild west. People will do whatever they want. And within that will be those individuals or companies that want to make the maximum amount of profit possible with the least amount of expenditure and sacrifice those outcomes and the well-being, either of the guests or the employees that work for them. They'll pay the employees the least and are quite happy to dismiss really optimal outcomes for their guests or their clients or their patients, whatever you want to call them. We call them guests. So in putting together a gold standard, we didn't want to have any of those systems imposed upon us or those requirements imposed upon us. So we sat back and said, well, what's it going to take to create a gold standard that can be emulated elsewhere and seen as a model that is utilizable no matter where you are in the world, but especially in the Western Hemisphere. But also recognizing that, if we step back for a second, a lot of people will say that the DSM-5, right, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Mental Health, is really a document that's designed to streamline insurance processing and payout, right? So if you look at something like cognitive behavioral therapy, that is an empirical approach to therapy that's recognized, it's measurable, and leads to outcomes that are reasonably high. It's supposedly a 70% outcome with CBT. I think the reality is very different. So also recognizing that we as a company need to standardize as much of what we do, document in detail, and create processes around as much of what we do, and then try to empirically measure what we do and look at the outcomes and generate some consistency there as well. And of course, there's always going to be a headcount factor, an investment factor. So for us, we didn't want to wait until the federal US government or the Jamaican government, for that matter, says you need to have a psychiatrist on your team. We pay a substantial amount of money out for a psychiatrist on our team, although we've never had to use them, okay? But to me, that's not a risk I'm willing to take. So other aspects of that gold standard, it's everything from how we cultivate, the standards we have in the cultivation of our mushroom product, the testing that we get done regularly at the science research labs here, so we know the quality of what we're working with and the potency, how they're stored, how they're safely handled, into the therapeutic space, how we treat each mental health condition that we're dealing with, from end-of-life anxiety through OCD, through treatment-resistant depression. All of this we've managed to document and create protocols around, so that we have a Bible for the company from when a guest first arrives or makes contact with us to when they finally depart and go home and continue their group integration. So it goes left to right, laterally in detail, and then vertically in detail into each aspect of what we do as well. And then
Go ahead.
So I was going to say, and then we reconcile that back because we use rating scales, recognized rating scales for measuring PTSD, depression, anxiety, and a variety of other conditions. So we know the baseline of the guests before they come here. And then we follow that up with the same rating scales a month later, and 3, 6, 9, 12. And so we get to see how we work on the ground here in our protocols impact those outcomes and make them better or not as good. And so we get to tweak our process as we go as well.
So one way for me to conceive of that is like, wow, this is a really great thing that you're doing on behalf of the whole industry itself by creating a place from which standards can be sort of legislated from like the top-down perspective. And it would make sense that, I mean, fingers crossed this would make sense, although historically this is not actually what I noticed happening with the legalization of cannabis in Canada, for example, is that you would go to the people who are the most experienced with the best sort of data and get them to sort of to contribute on how the legislation unfolds. Now in Canada, what actually happened was there was a question about how can the most money be made through this process, and how can we ensure that only people who have lots of money are able to be the ones making the money for the most part. Let's legalize based on those variables. Now, there must have been a bit of a mix, but there's very little confidence in me that the US government or many other governments, at least in the Western world, are going to go for well, maybe not the EU, but that's an aside, kind of go for let's talk to the experts and see what makes the most sense from an expert perspective on how to do the business right, rather than how can we profit off of this the most? Because the reality is governments are ultimately corporations that are trying to drive their standings in a larger sort of worldwide, corporate competition with other countries who are also, corporate standings with other countries who are also corporations. So anyways, so my thoughts are, oh, wow, that'd be really nice, these standards to offer. But that really depends on, okay, so perhaps you would release that kind of information to a government body who is looking to get from you some consulting for, the development and implementation of legislation. Another way is like, okay, but then it could actually help a lot of other companies to have a good standard of care, not because of legislation, but because they have this data too.
Mm-hmm.
But that would depend on whether or not you intend to open source or publish the data that you're having, your standards of protocol. And now we come into a question of whether or not you're doing all this for proprietary reasons. So where are you at with respect to your data and what you're learning as being proprietary or open source? Because I think the difference there makes a big difference to its impact on the larger psilocybin industry rather than just legislation and your standing as a business.
So here's an example. Okay, I'll give you some key points about the gold standard model. Then I'll compare that to how I think other retreat centers I'm aware of are operating. Okay, so we have a ratio of roughly one team member to every 1.5 guests. So on a retreat of 12 people, typically we'll have 8, 9, 10 facilitators, including the retreat leader who's a licensed therapist, the lead therapist for the retreat that's licensed, and the rest of our senior facilitators. And facilitators, for the most part, are therapists, licensed clinical social workers, counselors. So we do a ratio of 1 to 1.5. Other organizations, one team member for every 4 guests, only has one psychotherapist, okay, but is supported by a sound therapist or a yoga teacher. They will come to the island, do a couple of retreats, then head back to the US. So they're not required to develop work permits. We have a lot of accommodation that we have to invest in down here because we have 20 to 25 people on the island at any given time. So we're flying people in, we've got the accommodation costs, the flight costs, food costs. And of course, a lot of these people might be earning between $100 to $200 an hour US with a typical 35 to 40 hour client load back home as well. So all of this takes a lot of money. So as you can see immediately, our business isn't as efficient compared to that other company that's doing it on a much more mediocre level when it comes to staffing and all these other requirements I've talked about, many, many more. Now, I recognize at the same time that somebody that's very cost conscious may look at our retreat, which is 7 days and 3 doses. And by the way, the 3-dose regimen is something that we've developed over time and we find is the most effective. There are others that will do a 1 or a 2-dose type approach towards this, okay? I can tell you the amount of guests that come to us that do not launch on their first dose and sometimes even don't launch on their second dose for whatever reasons. You don't want to be coming on a retreat and it's a 1 or 2 dose experience and you fail to launch on your first and now it's all riding on the second. So there's all these different factors. I would also say that there's a lot of big companies circling the space, whether it's Jamaica or they're getting ready for the US, whether it's Oregon, Colorado, New York, Utah, ready to roll out, that are big brand companies that have very, very deep pockets that we will be competing against. And so from my perspective, I'm going to keep that information proprietary for now. Okay, our protocols, our gold standard, our clinical practice manual. What we also have is 3 different data containers, one of which I've spoken about, but one data container is a very detailed application form that covers the guest's entire medical history and mental health history and medications. The second data set we have is the clinical notes that our therapists keep throughout the week. That's very structured now. We do that, keeping a record of people's doses, how they responded, this kind of thing. And then the third data, which I've talked about, is the rating scales, okay? So merging all these 3 disparate sources into one, we'll be able to put out a lot more valuable findings out of that. But how we differentiate as a therapeutic model versus others that might be more wellness focused means there's quite a big gap between the two. Okay. If I was to go and put our crown jewels out there and make it open source for everybody, I imagine for those that wanted to invest, the gap, the differentiation gap would begin to close very, very fast. All right. And so from a business perspective now, when you have so much competition and not much to differentiate yourself between the competition, what you then have to do is spend money on branding and marketing and awareness to make sure the brand presence is in everybody's mind. And that's how you differentiate yourselves. And that's a very expensive game to play.
Sure.
So,
and a game that is hard to outcompete with major companies. Huge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So our goal is to remain boutique. We're not going to be a factory farming people through here. We're going to be opening up in the US slowly over time. But my belief is that if we focus on quality, remaining boutique, keep hiring the best quality people, keep the ongoing education going and transferring all of our knowledge from, say, 4,500 doses administered to 1,500 people, that's N of 1,500, bringing all of our team members up to speed is going to help continue to differentiate us. I'm very proud of the fact that we've got over 200 5-star TripAdvisor reviews now as well that speak to the outcomes of our guests. But in recognizance as well that this is a service industry, and no matter what type of service industry you're in, ultimately, we are training our competition. So rather than try to get my arms around that and build in very heavy non-compete type clauses into contracts, we have some protections. My view is that you come to us and you leave with our blessing in the hope that when you go back out into the world, whether it's another retreat center or it's private practice, you are firstly an ambassador for psilocybin, and secondly, you're an ambassador for MycoMeditations because you've gained all the experience and knowledge here, and now you will go and do.
People who are your employees, you mean?
Are my employees, yeah. But it's in recognizance that we're training our competition here, right? So if you want to look at it from a cynical perspective, that's a hard thing to balance. Now, unfortunately, there are many people that we can hire that have had shamanic experience, but the shamanic experience isn't our model. So as I cast around looking for, say, retreat leaders and lead therapists that A, have a licensure in their background, B, have substantial personal use for psychedelics, C, have worked to some degree within the psychedelic underground, most likely one-on-one or very small group work, they're very, very, very hard to find. And so we will find people that are willing, they will come and train, but obviously as America hots up in these different states, if your resume says you've spent 2 years working with Myco as a retreat leader, done this many retreats, this many guests, that helps you rise to the top of the resume pile. And it doesn't take much in the way of something glittery back home to attract people to want to go back there again. So
sure,
these are the
very
challenges.
Significant paycheck, right? Because
yes, that comes. Yeah, exactly.
Corporate headhunting is going to come into the psychedelic. It already is in the psychedelic field, right?
Exactly.
Hamilton Morris getting picked up by Compass, for example. I don't know his reasons. I'm not making any judgments, but I mean, he did leave one thing that seemed to be really great to go to something else, which from my perspective doesn't seem to really be that great. But yeah, again, I don't envy your position. This sounds like a very complicated balancing act that you're here, that you're working under.
Yeah, we act in good faith when we hire people. We always bring the best versions of ourselves as a corporation and individuals to that relationship, with the hope that that'll be reciprocated back to us, and people will spend a reasonable amount of time because we'll invest in them and we will train them and we will give them the responsibility when they're ready. But if they reach that point and then it's bye-bye, that doesn't leave a very good taste in the mouth, but it is what it is, right? I'm not going to try and, it's like holding on to somebody in a romantic relationship that doesn't want to be there anymore. It's a ridiculous exercise. So they go with our blessing.
Sure. And in some sense, to try to do so would be almost anti-psychedelic in a way.
Yes, it would be. Yeah, now, very much so.
I just said that was the last kind of question, but I still feel like maybe it's just because I have this hope. I have this hope that you're going to be like, of course. But that the data that you have these data pools, I can't remember what the exact term you use, that eventually they will translate into publication. And
Oh,
ideally, it
absolutely.
would be peer-reviewed publication. Peer-reviewed publication does require access to your database, though, which would
Yeah.
mean you would need to give access. And I'm not sure how that works, if like the access needs to be open or if it could be proprietary only to the reviewers or what. But like, do you have it in mind that the work that you're doing here will also contribute to the research end of developing clinical practice rather than just the, well, I said just, pardon the language, but like just the business end of developing a retreat center?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I ultimately know it's going to go open source. The only question is one of timing, right? And for all the reasons I've discussed, whether that's a year out or 5 years out, I just can't say right now. We have to establish ourselves on a much surer footing in Jamaica and the US. And frankly, I want to see how the psychedelic industry shapes out, beginning in Oregon. What's going to come out of the woodwork? Which parties within the space are going to start devouring each other in the race to be at the top or to be the holier than thou or to be the gatekeepers even, right? Having said that, in the past, we have done research, a couple of research projects with Imperial College London. We did a research project with Glasgow University. All of our data is de-anonymized and has been peer reviewed or will be peer reviewed. So we will always do the best we can to work with research institutes to forward their research as well. I think it's absolutely necessary, whether it's part of a multi-site research, or we're looking at one coming up next year that will just be at our location, which is looking to evaluate the therapeutic alliance between the facilitator and the guest. I think we all know what the outcomes are going to be, but this has to be measured and proven,
of course,
put out there, right?
That's how science works.
Yeah.
You can't just go with, probably.
Yeah, feels right.
Science. Yeah. Okay, so this is great. I didn't anticipate we'd spend so much time on the sort of like business corporate discussion end, but I'm feeling very satisfied and inspired. So I feel really alive in this conversation. So that's great. Unanticipated, positive. But let's shift tones a little bit to where my mind was intentionally going, which is on the sort of like boots on the ground, working with people. Now, you said this in our call together, and you just mentioned it a moment ago, which is that MycoMeditations prioritizes and centralizes an approach that does not have shamanic elements. So I'm wondering, A, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like? And B, why do you feel that it's important to do that?
Okay. I have a lot of respect for indigenous practices and cultures and their 1,000+ years legacies of working with psychedelics communally and for healing. But I recognize at the same time that what the psychedelic industry needs that it currently doesn't have is a language and vocabulary to translate the world of therapeutic psychedelics into the mind of the average Western individual. Okay. So let me say that I think that I've worked within the indigenous practices. Okay. And for many, a shamanic retreat or a shamanic approach is quite attractive to them. It's a pull towards the exotic and something different. But from what I've witnessed and seen, unless you are fully enculturated within that shamanic belief, within that cultural belief, a component of which is the shamanic, the efficacy is not as good as it could be. Okay, so the outcomes are not as great as they could be. The second thing is that if you look at Latin American ayahuasca type practice, some of its core tenets are uses of the occult and spiritual forces. Okay, it's foundational for that approach. Going back to the future of psychedelics in the US, I can't see the government on a federal level anointing anybody to clinically work in a shamanic type approach and use occult
part of the legislation
forces.
Is like, you have to make sure that you're cleansing the space, that only good intending entities are able to enter into the ceremonial space. Like if you're not doing that, you're in trouble from government. Johnny Government's coming down. I interrupted with that playful comment.
No, that's okay. No, it's spot on. So that's another component, right? That's not going to be a working model, I think, that's going to be recognized in the US and adopted. So we'd be pushing the barrel uphill. The other area, I would say, in retrospect or in hindsight, perhaps, is that so many of our guests when they're talking to our operations director, are booking a retreat for the first time and they want to come out here, they're doing their due diligence. They say they did not want to go on a shamanic retreat. It's scary to them. It's the unknown to them, and it kind of turns them off. And whether it's the core, genuine shamanic type retreat, or whether it's the more westernized approach with what you might call the plastic shaman, who's a Westerner with all the props, dressed in white robes, doing his or her thing with a strange indigenous name they've given to themselves or claims to have been given to them, but they don't have the 10, 20-year practice within their lineage. They've had a great experience, now they want to heal the world. Or maybe there's an aspect to them, we see that a lot in the psychedelic space, we hear about it a lot. It tends to attract the dark triad type individuals, the Machiavellian traits, narcissistic traits, and sociopathic, psychopathic traits. All of that is just very scary to a lot of our guests. So what we've tried to do is create a Western contemporary model, and the language that we use is, I think, medical language is off-putting to guests, and that's not the right vocabulary either. Okay, so neither the shamanic and that belief system or the medical language is the right language for this space. So as we develop our therapeutic language and how we talk about things, for example, we won't use the word ceremony, we won't use the word ritual. These are all trigger words, actually, for our guests that come here distinctly trying to avoid the shamanic approach. As an example, if a therapist turns up down here in ayahuasca print pants and dream catcher earrings and wafting incense sticks, they'll be told pretty quickly, neutralize what you're wearing, please, right? Or get on a bus and go back to the airport. Because in my mind, there's a lot of peacocking that happens in the psychedelic space, right? People are advertising that they work in the psychedelic space just by their clothing and their wear. And in some respects, okay, if you've been and spent 20 years in Brazil and emerged out of the jungle and you've been enculturated, I get it. But those are looking to create a false persona or a false identity and equip themselves with the props and the accoutrements are really plastic shamans, and they don't understand purely the power of the substances they're using. And they tend to mix in a mishmash of Eastern mysticism and New Agey stuff. And in my mind, it's so diluted. These are not strong foundations or scaffolding to build around a person that's having a peak or mystical or otherworldly experience. Okay, I've seen that go wrong too many times where they go in over their heads. So we're looking to develop a Western contemporary model with language that most people are relatively familiar with, where we do move not into the shamanic, but into the, say, non-traditional psychological areas, is we use a lot of depth psychology, okay? We explain the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, the impact of unconscious patterns from childhood, how they impact our lives. We can talk about synchronicities and correlation, causation between the interior world, the exterior world. We are certainly nestling a lot of our therapeutic dialogue and approaches within depth psychology, and certainly the mythopoetic, Jungian mythopoetic layer is very, very useful for helping our guests make sense of and interpret the symbology that often comes up in their mushroom sessions as well.
Well, I mean, I can completely appreciate what you're speaking to here and why. I mean, my career started with me developing that kind of a language for myself, the sort of understanding for myself. You know, mind you, I had a lot of critical self-appraisal I had to go through around the sort of some of the hubris that I had early on, and I guess integrity is something you learn over time, as we spoke earlier. But and even like my first book, Decomposing the Shadow, part of the intention was very much like, let's give a language to this that makes, like, for the most part, the every person understand, for the most part, kind of generally what could happen here and how it does make sense from the perspective of living your normal life, even if things are beyond. So I think that's great. My question is, my next one is, okay, so depth psychology is great. And yet there's still some things that happen. I mean, you've been in it, right? Like, you've been in the occult and shamanic history yourself. You know, there are some things that happen that, sorry, you know, like Western psychotherapeutic depth psychology language, you know, actually using it in that case is almost, I've heard the term psychologizing an experience that actually is beyond that. Could be, like putting a ceiling on something that needs to breathe the outside air. So how do you manage staying within that lane, while also, realistically encountering and supporting people through experiences that are sometimes way outside of it?
Absolutely. So I guess a common example, and I'm sure you've heard this before, experience maybe yourself, a voice was communicating with me on my trip. Okay, so is it God? Is it a part of me? Is it an autonomous complex? Is it a repressed aspect of my psyche? According to which framework you want to put it in, right? Is it a disembodied spirit? Okay, and so
is it the mushroom?
Is it the mushroom? Yes, that's another one. Or is it an alien, right? So all manner of things. And it's not like people on our retreats don't consistently have visions that include the praying mantis, right? And all these types of things that you generally won't hear about in the scientific journals, and they rarely make it into the popular science and popular press either, except as maybe headline clickbait, but not as a commonality to many, many psychedelic trips. So yes, I mean, certainly within the ayahuasca space, I've had that electrified, angelic type being hovering 3 feet in front of me like this, fully present, and not just somehow a symbolic rendition of something, but something that had sentience and intelligence and was looking to relate and communicate with me. And what I'll say to you is this, James, is that I have been in the last 20 plus years down so many rabbit holes trying to find the answers, but there are no answers that I find adequate enough. I think the shamanic interpretation of disembodied spirits, whether they're in the interior or the exterior, right, all the way through to repressed aspects of the psyche, can all speak to a lot of these experiences. And so what I ended up being is, rather than fixated on proving what this is or isn't, I became kind of radically agnostic about it to protect myself. That doesn't mean I'm not passionate and curious, and I love it each time when this otherworldly stuff happens. But we will tend to, we won't infuse a conversation with our guests about all this kind of stuff beforehand. But if a guest has an experience like that and they talk about it in integration and they've been touched by this experience and they've lived it, then you've got a much more open mind and heart that you're working with, but you have to be extremely careful due to their suggestibility and their openness. And so we will, all of our team members use psychedelics frequently, okay, and have a lot of experience and have worked in the space a lot, thousands of hours for some of them. Have all had their own myriad of experiences, from dead relatives showing up to aliens to otherworldly beings to incredible synchronicities, all interlinked throughout the whole week, happening together, trillion to one type chance synchronicities happening one after the other and all related, that they've all got an understanding and have a framework of understanding around these things. But we're never going to say, because this happened and it was that it was therefore the reason is this and what you were facing was that. We tend to work with the mushrooms more in metaphor than anything else, and we will create the scaffolding around the guest that will allow them to create their own meaning out of the experience. And often what we find over the course of the week is, if some otherworldly entity did turn up, even though it may have been confusing why they were there or what meaning they had to that person, it tends to be that by the end of the week, it's kind of woven into their story of the retreat for a week, and it all tends to make sense as to what it is, where it came from, why it is. We're never going to know the answers to these questions until we get the final curtain call on the stage of life, right? And we depart this earthly realm. Maybe we'll get some of the answers, but to try and hang my hat on a particular coat hook and build a framework of educating our guests around one particular area, I don't think is the right way to go, for the reasons that I've said.
Well, I already know what's real because it's what I already believe. No, anyways, no, this is great. I mean, like, you're speaking about like leaning into a radical agnosticism for yourself, and then being able to sort of sit in that when people are confronted with the sort of the disorientation of something emerging as mystery. And what I'm also hearing you saying is very similar to I think to how I hold it when I'm working with people for integration, is like whether or not that was or wasn't real or not real in the sort of freestanding reality, you experienced it, and so it has a real impact on you. So pragmatically, it makes sense to lean into it as having really had an impact and work with that impact rather than trying to work with whether or not it's real from like a, what's the term, like nominally real. I think there's
nominally real, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So for the listeners, phenomenal, like in the mind, constructed by the mind, or like constructed as subjective experience, nominal being whatever is actually outside of subjective experience. So yeah, I hear you. It sounds like you're doing something to that effect too, rested in a kind of like compassionate support of the challenges for any person to confront something so far beyond, their sense of what's possible. I imagine you come up to with some people who go there, but they're not really disoriented because they're like, oh yeah, that was wild. Like, they're not disoriented by it, but some would be, I imagine, very swept off their feet in a significant way.
Yeah. I mean, another example is often we're working with guests that have these, I'm going to call them blockages, energetic blockages on their physicality somewhere. And one guest can simply say, I feel stuck, I feel blocked, it's in this part. We'll do some somatic work with them to help shift that block and release it. Another guest could describe that same block and say, but it's red. I see a red face with fangs and yellow eyes, and it looks evil. And if they have any understanding of this, they might conclude that it's a disembodied entity nesting in their energy field somewhere. We would never volunteer that information to them. Okay, if they start to articulate that, then that's what we can work with them, but in quite a neutral way. So we're not going to lead them to that kind of conclusion themselves unless they give voice to it.
So one thing is that, I mean, you've worked in the occult shamanic side for many years, like as a participant, as someone learning in the retreat thing, your sort of background. I mean, is it not the case that during the ceremony, not ceremony, whatever you're calling it, that events happened, session. Okay. So that events happen where as a facilitator, you maybe experience some things going on that are like, oh yeah, there was something in the room, or so on and so forth. Now, maybe you don't speak to that with your participants. Maybe you can't you're not going to speak to it at all here, but like, does events like that happen, and are your facilitators sort of trained as well to sort of manage that kind of thing? Or is it such that without a primed context for such a thing to happen, such things don't happen?
Part of you is right. Part of me doesn't really want to answer any of this at all. But weird stuff does go down. I tend to find it happens a lot when I'm leading a retreat, because I'm there to deal with it, and I know how to deal with it, and I'm not intimidated by it when I come across it. I don't particularly want to go into the detail of that, what that looks like. It's not something that's done in the center of the dosing space, surrounded by a bunch of people observing. If anything, we'll take someone off to one side. It's very low key, and the whole situation is resolved within 10 minutes. But don't think it's like the worst type of horror movie where the heads are spinning around on the shoulders. And,
sure, you're not doing what's the word I'm looking for?
Exorcism. No.
Exorcisms or anything.
No. There are some. I would say that there are some interesting depossession type techniques, and again, this goes back to the whatever it is we're dealing with: repressed aspect of the psyche, disembodied entity, whatever, autonomous complex. It's not so much the what it is that I'm interested in. It's the techniques that I can use with that individual to help release them from that thing. So long as the techniques work, that's all I really care about. And so I will work with a number of different techniques that I've been taught and I've used in the past that I know can be effective. Sometimes you've got to adjust yourself slightly for what's going on, but a lot of it's heavily based in somatic type work as well. Some dialogue in some cases. It's almost like the person you're working with has taken a step to one side and somebody else has come through. There's a certain dialogue technique that can be used there, but on the whole, it's not that common. Compared to ayahuasca, I mean, I would say the differences with high-dose psilocybin and high-dose ayahuasca, I tend to find high-dose psilocybin is a very unitive space, and high-dose ayahuasca is a very interactive space, especially if you have a breakthrough experience, given the amount of entities that exist in there that show up all the time. Very, very much not the case in the psilocybin space.
So that actually, that clarifies a kind of lens that I was holding that actually is not as applicable as I thought it was when I was using it, which is because of the consequence, I haven't sat in a lot of like psilocybin ceremonies that were facilitated for me, except for ones that were shamanic, and were shamanic specifically coming from training in ayahuasca and applying an ayahuasca kind of technique to the nuances of psilocybin. That, so I was under the assumption of like ayahuasca, like there are entities, there's all sorts of shit going on. Like, how do you manage that without the language of it? And then realizing like, oh, actually, perhaps my assumption of how often that kind of thing is happening was incorrect, based on ignorance.
I can't say that I've ever done ayahuasca in a non-shamanic environment before, so I've got nothing to compare and contrast with, but certainly between high-dose psilocybin and high-dose ayahuasca, I'm able to make that comparison for sure. But I'd also say finally that we know that our methods that we're using deliver excellent outcomes. We track it, we measure it. And if therefore what we're doing is good enough to deliver these types of outcomes, why do we now need to abandon or alter what we do and introduce shamanic elements into that? Because seemingly for the Western mindset, they don't seem to be at all required or needed to achieve the outcomes that we're getting with people.
Cool. So earlier you mentioned, excuse me, I slurred a bit. Earlier you mentioned, I guess it's not a slur, it was a drawl. Doesn't matter. Earlier you mentioned that you have a psychiatrist on staff. And when we had our prep call, you had mentioned that the psychiatrist is on staff to prescribe psychiatric medication if needed, to prescribe and administer psychiatric medication. Why is that there, and what type of scenarios are you preparing for that such an intervention would be warranted?
Okay. I have witnessed more times than I care to count individuals being blown wide open via their psychedelic use, and then and or enter into states of hypomania that continue into mania, and if not adequately managed, develop into a full florid psychosis. Okay. You can consider that there are two types of psychosis, primary and secondary, where primary arises out of a schizophrenic episode, this type of thing, and secondary might be substance-induced psychosis. But I also know, I know many stories of people that have gone on 8-week-long silent meditations in India and have descended so deep into their unconscious that they've entered into a psychotic state. Now, I have a bit of a theory about psychosis, which we can touch on later if you like. So having witnessed that so often, not at MycoMeditations, I was not willing to take that risk with Myco. So our screening process for guests has evolved a lot over the years. It's extremely thorough. Our denial rate for applications is in the 25 to 30% range. So again, another fact that we are not putting profits over the well-being of our guests and the guest outcomes. 30% denial rate, I think, is very high. Many of those denials are because there is a personal or familial history of schizophrenia, likewise bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 disorder, and thirdly, some prior experience with psychosis in the past. Not something we are willing to entertain. And so all of my team members are trained and educated in spotting the early warning signs of hypomania, mania, and psychosis. We have a protocol for how we deal with that. And it's not, it costs me tens of thousands of dollars to have a psychiatrist on my team that's available on call to come down here that we've never had to use. But it's not something I'm willing to even have a tiny risk around that we don't have that covered. And so, of course, people can lie on their application forms, right? Back in the early days,
or they could not know,
or they could not know. It could be a latent disorder that only emerges through a stressful emotional experience with psychedelics. Sometimes we see that where there's been a lot of early sexual abuse, childhood abuse, where the psyche is so fragmented that the duct tape holding the psyche together is stronger than the parts, and that something resembling a psychosis can happen. And it's almost like a creative deconstruction, a necessary creative deconstruction of the psyche so that person can come back to healing again. But as we know in the Western world, people are medicated back to quote unquote whatever their normality is. And so we are not going to risk people developing hypomania, mania, or psychosis. And so we have the medications and the professional team members on hand should that ever occur.
So I do want to ask you about this theory about psychosis. Possibly what I'm about to ask you is going into that domain, but otherwise it'll be the next question. When we were on the call, you made the mention of like needing to be able to adequately, or say accurately, track and differentiate between a mania or a hypomanic episode and what you called, quote, a normal acute psychomemetic response. So what is that difference? And maybe this is the proprietary stuff, but like, what is that difference? And like, how is it that we know how you would manage perhaps the extent to somebody is like perhaps moving into developing a psychosis while you have a psychiatrist on staff, but how do you manage this normal acute psychomemetic response, and even what is that?
Okay. So a psychotomimetic response is simply you take a substance, a psychedelic, an LSD or meth, even any kind of substance like that, and it can induce symptoms that seem to mimic psychotic symptoms. Okay. So how we see that on retreat, this psychotomimetic response, it begins with like a low-grade paranoia and vigilance. That can develop into an acute paranoia, an extreme hypervigilance, in many cases, a seeming detachment from reality, and in some cases even, especially where people have been traumatized in early childhood, raped and that kind of thing, they can develop a bit of a persecutory complex. Is somebody out to get me? Am I going to get raped and get murdered? Okay. And of course, a psychotic, by definition, doesn't realize that they're psychotic. And when an individual is in the psychomimetic space, it's more or less the same thing as well. Now, what I've seen in the underground psychedelic network, and this is where my experience comes from, is it's not typical. So we witness a lot of the psychotomimetic responses. We manage them in certain ways according to their severity. But 95 times out of 100, everybody in our group, in our cohort, is coming up at the same time. They're in the peak for about the same time, and they're going to start coming down out of the peak experience for the same time. So we know that if there's either high neuroticism in a guest, which we're looking out for, that high neuroticism correlates with a psychotomimetic or a higher probability of a psychotomimetic response. We know secondarily that if there's early childhood abuse that hasn't been addressed too well in therapy, or indeed the guest is recovering abuse memories from an event that happened that they had forgotten, well, not forgotten about, but when the abuse was happening decades ago, they experienced dissociative amnesia, and the memories were placed in the unconscious mind, and the body held on to the physiological and emotional response of that. We do see that typically by the end of the session, they are fully back on the ground and back to normal again. So it's a lot to do with the background, what we know about them, their propensity towards having a psychotomimetic response, how we then deal with it. But the big kicker, the trigger is, if by the time everybody else is down and it's been a couple of hours, and this person is still in an agitated psychotomimetic state, that's going to warrant the initiation of our protocols to contact the psychiatrist, and then we then begin to act with an even higher abundance of caution. There's one wrinkle, and there's research that supports this, Some people with early childhood abuse that have never had that treated in therapy, as they recover the memories, they can become a bit hypomanic, and that hypomania can continue for a while after they've come down and even into the next morning. But typically by the next morning, it's gone again. It's completely dissipated. So in a case where...
Dude, please finish that in a second. But that actually brings up like my curiosity, because it seemed like you'd said, you know, like you haven't had to use the psychiatrist at all thus far since you've had them on staff. But in my mind, I'm like, it can't be that rare that somebody who is, you know, like I imagine you're bringing in a lot of people that are dealing with some pretty difficult stuff, that they wouldn't have psychotomimetic response or some sort of something that continues into you know, a couple of days afterwards, or at least for a little while. And so in my mind, I'm like, oh, it would seem weird that your first response after that would be to go towards psychiatry. But it sounds like what you're saying is that's sort of like, that's the trigger for an alert to go on, but there are still sort of like progressive stages of intervention that follow from there before you move towards psychiatric medication. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. We would never call in the psychiatrist for a psychotomimetic response because we deal with it hundreds of times per year. Okay. And typically,
even if it extends into like the next day.
We've had 2 occasions in the last few years where there's been where the guest has come back down to earth, had some cognitive dissonance because of what they've just recovered from their memories that they didn't know about, have become a little hypomanic at the very, very low end. That would warrant a call to the psychiatrist as a heads up, we've got this going on. And then the psychiatrist would interview the retreat leader and therapist and team, assess that, and then we would take their guidance. And typically, because of what we know about the research, if that person was still in the same state the following morning, that would warrant the psychiatrist being on site. But what we tend to see is that the symptoms of all the hypomania are getting weaker and weaker and weaker and dissipate over time. And so as we're working with somebody in a psychotomimetic state where there's a complete detachment from reality, you know, you'll want to offer them some water, okay? They'll want to drink, or they're thirsty, or they haven't hydrated, they're soaked in sweat. We've got to have them drink. You'll offer them a glass of water knowing that they're going to turn it down because they think you're trying to poison them. So often what you have to do is hold the glass, crack open a fresh bottle of water, and they will witness you pouring it in and then hand it to them. That's one thing. That's quite a commonality, that type of thing that we're dealing with as well. It can be that the person suffering with that acute response originally had a very close bond and trust with the retreat leader or even the therapist. But all of a sudden in that psychotomimetic state, you're the last person they trust because now they think they've joined a cult and everybody in the team is an actor, okay? Even some of the guest actors have somehow been brought here as part of this big persecutory complex scenario that they're going through.
Wow, and so I totally had that experience.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Yeah. I would totally be screened out if I tried to apply for your retreat.
No, I mean, not for that one. It's very common.
Okay.
So we will rotate, you know, then the protocol is, who is the person of trust? And obviously it's not the retreat leader because we are the head of the cult, right? That they've just suddenly realized that they're part of. So we'll decide, we will rotate people in from our team until we find the person that the afflicted person most trusts, and that trust builds. And then slowly you see they start to trust more. And then typically as they're coming further down off the end of that peak experience, they start to become a little embarrassed and ashamed because they've got some recollection of the accusations they were making and what they were doing, and they become very apologetic, and we take that in open arms. We reassure them it's quite okay. So that's how it tends to unfold practically for us.
I've also had the experience of coming down and being like, oh, I promised I wouldn't take my clothes off.
Yes. The nudity isn't too common. But when it happens, it's not in a sexual kind of way. It's much more back to nature, primitive, natural, being at one with myself, kind of hugging a tree or something like that on the rare occasion.
That's how it was for me. It wasn't sexual, although I did explicitly ask one of the facilitators if they would look at my naked body. No, I think actually at one point I asked politely if they would touch my genitals, and they were like, no, I don't think that's appropriate. And I was like, okay. It wasn't even sexual. I was just
Yeah.
I think I would just really like this experience right now.
Yeah.
I'm so naked. I just feel like I can't get any more naked, and I just feel so good. It'd be nice. But they were like, I don't think that's appropriate. And I was like, that's fair.
Totally. I mean, totally uninhibited. And the thing is, the good thing here is that if somebody does want to get naked, most of our guests, most of the time, are behind a mask in their peak experience and are completely unaware this is going on. The rest of the team divert their eyes. We are placed a male if it's a male, a female facilitator with a female guest, and that just kind of happens over there until they're coaxed to gradually put their clothing back on and retain some of their dignity again.
The facilitators that sitting with me, they were female, and they were like, I could look over and I could see them like this, like as in like peripherally, they're just watching to make sure I don't do anything harmful, but for the most part, it's like eyes to the side kind of thing. And I asked, like, one of the embarrassing thing I asked later, I was like, oh, did I come off as, I could come off as being kind of threatening if I'm asking those kind of questions. And they were like, no, you were so sweet and at no point seemed threatening. It just obviously wasn't appropriate. I'm like, yeah, I get that, but I'm glad you didn't feel unsafe. But anyways, so the question about psychosis is, so actually yesterday, I don't know when the release schedule will be, but yesterday I recorded an interview with Tim Reed. He works for the Institute for Psychedelic Therapy that has Maria Papaspirou, might not be pronouncing that correct, who's been on the show a couple of times. And they work, and they have a number of therapists on their sort of like our catalog team database. And it's all sort of Jungian depth psychology, seemingly. That's their sort of like MO, is taking it from that perspective. And one of the things that he was talking about was specifically what's called open dialogue method. And it's a way of, the way he framed it is that a complex or a coex system that is very intense and pre-verbal gets activated, and the person is not able to switch from being in process about it to processing it, and sort of the archetypal imagery or expression of these things get locked into a person's sort of sense of reality. And I'm doing my best to recapitulate this or like correctly say it. And that in such a case, psychiatric intervention could actually stop and block the processing necessary and just sort of like pharmacologically detach a person from being in process, which does not equal doing the processing, right?
Right.
He was not anti-medication. He was very strongly like, medication works when it is appropriately, like when the right medication is brought into the right time, and but often they're overly prescribed at the wrong times, because we don't have systems to understand how to support people through these types of episodes without just throwing drugs at them. And open dialogue is a system, I think he said, developed in Finland or in the Scandinavian zone, and that through that as the sort of institutioned practice, their rates of schizophrenia have gone down to nearly zero without pharmacological pharmacological intervention. Right. So now, mind you, that's sort of like, that's just a little bit of context, because I'm wondering, what is it that you're seeing that's different? You're like, I have my own views on psychosis. Is it similar to that, or is it a totally different track?
No, it's not too dissimilar, actually. This is a loose theory based upon anecdote and observation that I've seen. So first of all, on the psychomimetic response, if a person is approaching deep, horrendous trauma, the psyche is saying, don't go there. It's almost like the mind, not using a clinical phrase, chooses the psychomimetic response versus going there, okay? And I've read about that a lot happening with people uncovering deep trauma within meditation retreats, and the same thing happening. Okay, so there used to be a movement back in the 60s and 70s called the anti-psychiatry movement, and it was, one of the key founders was Dr. David Cooper, who's now dead, from South Africa. He was a psychiatrist, and another one was either R.D. Lang or K.D. Lang. One of them's a pop singer. The other one's a psychiatrist.
I think R.D. Lang is the psychiatrist or the psychologist. But now I'm not confident, because I'm actually identifying with your inquiry rather than the accuracy of the content.
So what they did is they opened a place in London, I believe, and Yes, the typical Western intervention method is if this person is a danger to themselves or others, medicate them to a place of safety, bring them back to their baseline with medication over time. And they didn't take that approach. And, they would not work with people that were a danger to others or to themselves. But obviously, if you've been around people that are schizophrenic and psychotic, you have to be at ease around people that are in that kind of state, right? If it's an ER ward in a hospital, it's not the psychiatrist that's dealing with the person. It's a couple of mental health nurses trained in mental health restraints, right, that will restrain the person on your behalf, and then you administer the medicine. So what they would do in this house that they rented in London, these psychiatrists, they take these people in with schizophrenia and psychosis, and they would let them literally act out all of their behaviors and mechanisms, from wanting to pee the bed at night, leaving excrement in the bed at night, wanting to roll and cover themselves in it, cover the room in it, act out thumb sucking, nipple sucking, this kind of thing. They would clean them up the next day, give them love, attention, not label what they were doing as wrong or bad. Okay, there was no pharmaceutical intervention whatsoever, and many of these cases actually progressed through healing and came through their psychosis and out the other side in a very healthy way. So that's that. Secondarily, I imagine you must be familiar with Stan Grof's spiritual emergency, which puts psychosis in another bracket altogether. And that's certainly, I lean more into that than I do the typical Western medical approach towards it and their type of intervention. But agreed, there are times when medication is absolutely needed and nothing else will do. But it seems to me that where a psyche has been developed on a very weak foundation, like I said, where it's fragmented and the duct tape holding the parts of the psyche together are stronger than the psyche themselves, it's like an almost a deconstruction of the psyche, an unraveling that needs to happen that takes them into psychosis, that if then treated correctly and allowed to be processed, they can emerge back into a healthier psyche again. But if that deconstruction of the psyche through psychosis is medicated, it interrupts that process and stops them processing and healing through it. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in this space yet. I think a lot more work to be done.
And it also sounds like MycoMeditations is not set up to support that process outside of, so it would make sense that you would be doing what is like the most acutely supportive to an individual who might be going into to prevent them from going into a psychotic response with respect to having a psychiatrist on staff.
Exactly. And the key is spotting hypomania and mania before it evolves into psychosis. Second thing is, the longer a person remains in psychosis for, the more damage is done to their gray matter. You need to better induce sleep. But obviously, if you can interrupt the process at the hypomania, early mania stage, that's the best thing all around. And frankly, according to our psychiatrists, not all evolutions from mania through mania to psychosis would warrant having to be treated in a hospital. Our psychiatrists would come on site, evaluate, and if they deem that person and our team competent enough to look after them here, they can convalesce in their rooms, and the psychiatrist would actually be on site the whole time, and we would be there to make sure that happened as well. So it's not always a case of, oh dear, mania, time to go to hospital, or psychosis, time to go to hospital.
Okay. So I have two more questions, perhaps three. We'll see, because we're coming up on time here. One of them I have remorse for not answering when we were in the corporate end of things, but I had it way so far down on my question list that I didn't remember it was there till now. But the one I definitely want to ask stays in that sort of boots on the ground place. And in our call, you had talked about that it was important that your facilitators are aware of this kind of thing and are prepared to handle what you called the projection of the golden shadow. Can you outline that a little bit?
Sure. I can either make the assumption that your listeners know what the shadow is, or I can do a quick recap of the shadow, and then what the golden shadow is, or how would you like me to handle that?
I would say do a quick recap.
Okay, so you can basically see that you have a conscious mind and unconscious mind, and the shadow is a part of the unconscious mind. And in short, you can see that it's all the things about yourself that you don't want to admit to. A tiny bit you do know, most of which you don't know, but these influences often formed in childhood through parents and society, become repressed aspects of our personality. So the shadow can be shame, it can be disgust, it can be fear, it can be terror, but it definitely has a more negative connotation. The golden shadow are all about strengths and greatness within ourselves that we have repressed from a very early age. So we all know people, for example, that have to dim their light around others. So, there are many great creators in the world that came out of severely abusive childhoods and went on to create great artistry, music, art, you name it, right? But just as many that came out of abusive childhoods and survived, there are those that developed self-destructive habits and repressed their creativeness and their strengths. And so what tends to happen is, working in the space that we do, if we find that a particular guest has an intense admiration towards a retreat leader or a lead therapist or a particular facilitator, that is a sign, not always, of a golden shadow projection. You see it in social media, right? How people are projecting their golden shadow over the Kardashians and Kanye and Elon Musk. They're projecting this intense admiration and greatness onto these people, but it's actually a repressed aspect of their shadow material. So there's two facets to this. The first facet is it's our job, whether it's dark shadow material or golden shadow material, to not accept those projections, to help the guests recognize those projections are going on, and to help to bring this material into the light and to integrate it into their personality so they can reap the benefits of their own golden shadow and these creative strengths that come up within them. The other side of things is you have probably, and your listeners have probably seen many Netflix documentaries about cults and gurus and spiritual movements and yoga movements. And what you'll see in many of them is that a well-intentioned individual that had done some work in life and was gifted had a following that built up around him or her over time. And their followers started to project the golden shadow onto this individual. And the danger in that is that if the individual starts to believe in this grandiosity and in this greatness and in this superiority and their specialness, that can begin to metastasize within their own shadow and their own being. And as we see with all these documentaries on Netflix, ultimately the individual collapses and the organization often collapses in around them once that has metastasized within them and reached the apex of its expression. They'll often, with these followers, dictate certain rules and ways of being in life that their followers have to do, but they don't have to observe themselves. We all know how the cult leader operates. And so for me, it's two-sided. It's making sure that, yes, my facilitators know that they are damn good at what they do. They're competent. That's an invitation to go inwards and recognize that without too much ego and specialness involved, but to recognize that when a golden shadow is being projected on them, that they're being called a guru, and there's this intense admiration, is to pass that back to the guest in the most compassionate kind of way possible. Because I'm not going to see MycoMeditations, whether it's me or my senior team members or anybody in my team, start to develop such an air of grandiosity that they believe that they can walk on water. And I've seen that happen so many times.
Well, that's good. I mean, like one of the biggest concerns I hold for any kind of sort of psychedelic community, be it professional and otherwise, is the sort of sometimes like slow boiled frog, pace of those kinds of things happening. Because, like you said, there are a lot of examples, Netflix and beyond, of what started as very genuine, beautiful, spiritual and otherwise communities, sort of essentially creating scenarios such as that. And so go ahead.
No, I was just saying it's almost like even if those individuals didn't have any particular narcissistic traits, how that can all evolve into a grandiose, even malignant type of narcissism is incredible to me. This pattern that keeps happening, we all need to be alert for it within any space that we work in, but especially psychedelics, to avoid that kind of thing happening. And I'm seeing it happening all over the place, though.
And I mean, it is such the case, you said, that dark triad personalities can thrive in certain structures, social structures. And what I'm hearing you say is that it is also the case, maybe similar to how people in the corporate world end up doing things that in hindsight they realize was so far outside of what they would normally believe to be right or something, that social structures can sort of distort a person into behaving and expressing in ways that otherwise they would not have as a consequence of sort of this of these structures and how it's contributing to a person's mind, which I think gives an opportunity. I mean, I think actions and responsibilities for actions, regardless of intention, are important. And at the same time, it sounds like you speaking almost compassionately to recognizing that there are some scenarios where it was a group effort to get somebody to the place where they became the villain. You know?
Yeah. But of course, if they are truly narcissistic, they're probably both the hero and the victim in their own story.
Okay, the mind, complex place. Okay, so this is the question I feel I regret not, bringing up earlier, but here we are. It goes back into the business end of things, and depending on your time frame, I might have another final question for you, but we'll see.
I'm open.
Tracking, I'm not in the professional world, or sorry, let me rephrase. I'm not in the corporate world for running retreats or so on and so forth. I'm in the sort of, I'm an author. I have my own ideas. I'm working on that sort of idea end of things, but I'm also, in some sense, a sort of radical journalist in the scene too. And I'm paying attention. And one of the things that I'm noticing, and I think is a very fair thing to notice, is, something tantamount to biopiracy. Something like, these psychedelic molecules or these psychedelic plants, that come from certain cultures who have stewarded them in the face of literally genocide, in certain instances, that all of a sudden these molecules are profitable to the Western people. And so now, oh, okay, cool. And such too is some of those practices that have been held in the face of, oppression and even genocide. Now they are profitable too. There's discussion there about biopiracy, spiritual extractivism. There's a lot of stuff that could be in this, but out of that is a question. The question is, how are companies that are now profiting off of the shift in mindset around these substances, how are they choosing to conduct themselves as a business in a way that gives back to the indigenous peoples and cultures from who were stewards of these medicines for so long? I mean, your company is utilizing psilocybin mushrooms, and there's two layers to this, and I'll put the second one out in a minute. You're working with psilocybin mushrooms. Now, perhaps psilocybin mushrooms have been used all over the place for a long time, but from what we know, it's like that we know about the tradition stems back down to the native people of what we call Mexico now, right? So it's like, so there's a direct line, right? Like we only know about it because, Maria Sabina gave it to this, white banker guy, right?
Awesome. Yeah.
So is that, okay, so other than the second layer, I'll bring that up in a second. Is that something that you're thinking about? And if you're thinking about it, how are you looking to apply it? With respect to maybe not necessarily to the people of Mexico or the Sierra Mazateca, but like in general with respect to psychedelic medicines and indigenous.
Okay. The meta level perspective that I have, and I have a problem contrasting this with the bottom up approach, but the meta level is as you look at the cannabis industry and the way that evolved, it wasn't the home growers, the small farms, whatever caricatures of whatever types of individuals you thought that were regularly using weed that funded cannabis and brought that to the masses, and to the point where we have legalization in many states, or at least decrim in others. Okay. It was capitalism and the bankers and those for-profit companies behind that put the money in that did it. Okay. Now, could the home growers and the small communes and everyone that was involved in low-level weed production or cultivation and use have ever achieved that? Possibly. Unlikely not, because they wouldn't have had the business expertise or the funding to achieve it. So the harsh reality is it's going to take money and business people, I think, for psychedelics to scale to the masses. to the masses that need them. And I'm not saying in the first instance the masses should have them for their spiritual experience or their consciousness enhancement. Of course, we're delighted when people have mystical experiences down here, or it's their very first spiritual experience, okay? Around about 40% of our guests have a mystical experience. But what we're dealing with right now is what's under our nose, which is an acute mental health crisis in the West. And it seems to be becoming more acute with every generation. It's is it the hierarchy of needs where, you know, food, water, and in order first? Let's get people free of their mental health conditions first, so they can begin to thrive again in life. And then once that's there, there's room for more spiritual and mystical growth, etc., and expansion of consciousness. So we're not a spiritual retreat. So the meta level is, it takes money to scale, it takes big business, but that comes with a lot of compromises and a lot of sour pills to have to swallow in the process, unfortunately. On a more local level, in Jamaica, there really is no history of indigenous use here, okay? The original inhabitants of Jamaica were peoples that came from Venezuela called the Taino. They established settlements all over Jamaica. We live right on top of an old settlement, actually. It's a very powerful place where one of our retreats are held. And there's no evidence that's turned up on the island about psychedelic or mushroom use within Jamaicans. The only history I'm aware of in Jamaica of mushroom use is going back to the 60s and 70s, when the Grill and 7 Mile Beach, which is now a tourist mecca that's densely packed with American tourists, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it's part of the hippie trail, okay? And there used to be a place called Miss Brown's Tea Shop, and she would make psychedelic mushroom tea, and the hippies would come by, the backpackers would drink that, and also some of the locals. And I know some of the locals now in their 60s and a bit older that used to regularly go down to Miss Brown's Tea Shop. So that's the oldest history that we know and we have here. Now, that again to one side, you know, given my English heritage, I'm acutely aware of the background that first the Spanish, then the English had here in Jamaica. I'm fully aware of all the colonial extraction that has continued to happen over the years as well. It's always been a part of our ethos that as a company, we were going to give as much back to Jamaica as possible. But you have to recognize, first of all, that unlike the US and Europe, where there's a lot of openness and people are coming switched on to psychedelics every day, there's a burgeoning interest. In Jamaica, that's not so much the case. It's happening very incrementally. Also, Jamaica is quite a religious society, quite conservative. You've got everything from the Seventh-day Adventists and everything in between down here that do not walk lightly around the concept of mushrooms. Some even believe that it's witchcraft and this kind of thing as well. So we made it our mission that rather than using MycoMeditations as that vehicle, I decided to found what's called the Caribbean Psychedelic Association about 18 months ago. The purpose of that organization is twofold. One, to represent all the different players in the industry in Jamaica, from cultivation through retreats, through clinical application, research and pharma, to make sure that their interests are represented well to the government and that we can work with the various ministries to ensure a reasonable level of standardization and regulation and licensing as this industry grows. The second purpose of the Caribbean Psychedelic Association was to make sure that we get, for the sake of the population health here, mushrooms out into the community. There's a lot of domestic violence here. There's a lot of inequality here. About 17% live below the poverty line. There's a lot of alcoholism here. Jamaica really needs mushrooms. But in the face, COVID has been, the government was focused on COVID for 2.5 years. 90% of their GDP is through tourism, something like that. As we were ready to speak with the Jamaican government about all of this, COVID hits, which caused them to refocus on other things. But I can assure you that the Caribbean Psychedelic Association is working quite well in addressing the Jamaican government to make sure that this can be introduced to Jamaicans at large, okay? But it's a slow process, given all the other factors that I've talked about and some resistance as well. What I can tell you, though, in the last 2 or 3 years, we are seeing an increasing amount of Jamaicans coming on our retreats and an increasing amount of cultivation happening all across the island, and also an increasing amount of clinicians that are Jamaican clinicians beginning to work with psychedelics as well. What we also do is the main medical training hospital here is called University of West Indies, shortened to UWI. We've had final year psychiatrists come down and train with us. Right now, I have 3 associate clinical psychologists that are Jamaican that have come down to work with us as well for a few months, with the goal that they'll go back into Kingston and Montego Bay as we take more of these people through. And frankly, a Jamaican clinician is the best person to administer psilocybin to a Jamaican. It's not a Westerner, well, like me, with all my baggage, historical baggage, and the cultural differences as well. So we also, as a function of being here in Treasure Beach, I can tell you that the trickle-down economy works really well here insofar as the money we spend on villas, the ground staff, the cleaning staff, the cooks, the chefs, transport companies, masseuses, restaurants, for all of our guests, means that about $1 million US goes into this very local series of fishing villages that we have. That leads to an increase in quality of life and living for all of the employees and their families. During COVID, we had quite a few fishermen that were unable to go and fish because restaurants weren't buying their food, no one to sell it to, that were getting depressed. And so when we hear about that, rest assured we're going to work with those local fishermen, give them psilocybin, and it doesn't cost them anything. Yet, a week later, when they're off their depression and out fishing again, they'll turn up with a lobster or a fish, and I'll gladly take it because that helps restore their dignity, right? The sense that they've paid in their own way for something they participated in. So that's really the tip of the iceberg of all the things we do. There's so much more that we do, from Christmas drives. We get donations from our guests to buy Christmas toys for about 200 kids here. We're sponsoring a spay and neuter program early next year for the wild cats and dogs that are here. So there's a lot that goes on where we're giving back to the community, and we hire as many Jamaicans as possible. The cultivation team is Jamaican. Quite a few of my team members are Jamaican nurses and, like I said, associate clinical psychologists as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Like hearing the extent to which you are like that you're attempting to funnel back like the positive benefits that working with psilocybin is bringing you as a company. I mean, I know that it's not about that, but that is happening, and that you're trying to funnel this back into the local community, because if it wasn't for this sort of unique legal status, you wouldn't be able to do any of this, right? And recognizing the context too of being like someone from the European English background coming in and then profiting once again off the sort of like unique legal situation that allows you to do a thing in this land that's not yours or something. And I really respect, at least from the extent of what you've told me. I'm not fact checking that you're actually doing all of these things, but I assume that you are, so that you're doing these things. I really respect that. The comment you made about the tough pill to swallow, very tough pill to swallow. Not sure I entirely, I recognize that that's the case, but I don't feel good about the recognition that it's the case, and thus that's that. To me, there's sort of recognizing that to be the case, and then because of that, efforting to try to, figure out, are there ways to modulate and adjust, this scenario so that it can be the case that these things come to legality and so on and so forth. And there's reciprocity with indigenous people involved too. Because, when you mentioned the cannabis and the hippies and so on and so forth, one level is saying like, yeah, they were never going to get it legalized. But if they hadn't continued doing what they were doing and risking jail and risking all the rest,
absolutely,
it wouldn't have gotten legalized at all, because there wouldn't have been a demand. Let me finish the comment. And the hippies didn't face genocide or cultural genocide. They face oppression and they face a number of things because of their use of substances, especially, like minorities excessively policed over the use of substances as a sort of racial control operation, utilizing substances as an excuse. But like the hippies did not go through what the people of South America went through, what the people of like the indigenous lands of North America went through. And this is an issue way bigger than the psychedelic industry, of course, and just the the retreat centers making bank in the psychedelic industries aren't going to solve this thing either. But to me, it's still there that this is an open question. And even though that's a tough pill to swallow, that doesn't mean that we can't be, efforting to figure out whether or not there's other things that we could be doing to sort of make it less toxic feeling.
Completely agree. And I didn't mean to be dismissive of either the home growers or the communal farmers or the hippies. I think I used the word, whatever caricatures you have in mind about those that we're using, right? Totally recognize that they were taking a lot of risks too, and exposure, and the whole civil rights movement and free love at the time was all part of that too. But yeah, not compared to what the indigenous people have been through in their time either. But having said that, I mean, I read recently that in New York, I think it's in Manhattan, New York, that those that had been locked up for minor cannabis infractions were the first ones to be granted licenses to be able to grow cannabis themselves and to be able to turn it into a positive. So those kind of things, I think, on a state level can be immediately effective. Where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, I agree. And I also recognize that we're not going to come up with the solution to this in this podcast. But it's also,
or maybe this decade.
Sure. I also believe that it's, I think, what's the word I'm looking for? It's incumbent on me. It's necessary for me knowing that these are issues and this is relative to the conversation that we speak to it, and the inquiry and the question and the wondering remains in our minds and in the minds of the people who are engaged in the scene or in the culture or in their own work or in their just daily life and happen to be tuning into the show here. So with that said, there was one thing you really wanted me to ask you about, but I didn't ask you about when we did our prep call, and maybe you sort of spoke to it already, maybe not. Now, if you've got the time, we're already 10 minutes over. Do you want me to ask you that, or can we end here?
You can ask me. I won't go. I mean, I'm a bit nervous about what it is now because I can't remember stating that. So go ahead. Okay.
Specifically, you had mentioned that you had some feelings about what's happening in Oregon right now, and some substantial concerns, and that like I think you had said something like you wanted to be given an opportunity to talk about that. Maybe really wanted me to ask you. Okay, perhaps mischaracterization, but there seemed to be like a desire in you to be given an opportunity to speak to that.
Okay.
And so here is that opportunity if you'd like it.
Thank you. So in many respects, I admire all the work that's been done in Oregon, to get it to where it is, where they're about to make psilocybin available for therapeutic use. What was originally positioned as a medical model has been substantially watered down. And I learned recently, maybe a couple of months ago, you might have to fact check this, I'm going to paraphrase it the best I can, but all that's required to administer psilocybin in Oregon is you don't have to have any licensure or background in mental health, that you do 120 hours of classroom work in theory and a 20 or 30 hour practicum, and then you are let loose to administer psilocybin with people. That terrifies me because I've seen, we can have 3 or 4 retreats back to back that are fairly low maintenance, low key, typical run of the mill. But over the years, I've been kicked, scratched, bitten, punched, spat upon. There can be violent outbursts that we have to deal with down here. If you handle the psychomimetic response poorly, this can lead to a decompensation in the guest that gets really hard to control. So I'm worried about the safety standards and the lack of experience that people are having. If you want to fly a jumbo jet with a couple of hundred people on board, you need 10,000 hours under your belt. I read in some states to be a cosmologist or something. Bless you. 2,000 to 3,000 hours. And yet here, all that's required to work with people's mental, emotional, and physical well-being and spiritual well-being is 120 hours of classroom work, theory, and a 30-hour practicum. And I am really extremely concerned that will not be enough to mitigate poorly handled cases, and that it's going to lead to a lot of bad press, whether it's people getting out of control, being re-traumatized, getting in their cars and driving on 8 grams of mushrooms, having an accident, killing somebody. We're going to see more and more of that happening. And that's going to lead ultimately to a change in legislation at the Oregon level. But the other states that are watching this as well, or the federal level are watching, it could lead to a slowdown in the rollout of psilocybin across all states. So I do recognize that because psilocybin is not legal in Oregon, where the hell are these people going to get their training from, right? So hopefully as it becomes legal and the training and experience people get catches up, we will get to a modicum of safety satisfaction and that type of thing. But I question what the screening processes are, what the experience of people is and how that's all going to roll out. It really concerns me, and for other states as well. So yeah, there it is.
Fair criticisms or concerns. And I also, in my mind, I'm like, thinking of the phrase of like, well, if you're going to make an omelet, you got to crack a few eggs, but then those eggs are people, and who could end up being significantly harmed, and so so like fingers crossed, it is not the worst case scenario. Because I mean, somebody had to legalize first. And I hope that the consequence of that on Oregon is not dire. But I hear what you're saying, and I didn't know these things that you were speaking to, and hearing them, I'm like, whew, that is very concerning.
Yeah.
So I can appreciate why you wanted to be given a platform to talk about it here.
Yeah, and I'm very appreciative of what they've done for minorities in Oregon. Typically, it's white people that have the financial wherewithal to train as therapists, and if you're part of the lower socioeconomic strata, you don't get that opportunity. There's recognition for the indigenous use in Oregon and native use as well. I would like to see the native use at least have a decent screening process to make sure no one's got bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, family history of that kind of thing. But if they've been doing it for many hundreds of years as part of their lineage, go for it. Let's just build in some safety net around that as well for the individuals as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially if they're working with people who aren't of their cultural community, right? So, because white people got different baggage. I mean, our baggage contributed to their baggage, to be 100% sure, but we got different baggage and need different kinds of care sometimes. Okay, so let's finish up, Justin. Long interview, great interview. I mean, from my perspective, I felt very turned on. I mean, intellectually. I mean, you can only see me from you can't see me from the waist down, but I promise it's not weird.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's nothing. There isn't any twitching going on.
No. So I really enjoyed this interview. Thanks so much. For listeners, where can they learn more about MycoMeditations? If you have social media, so on and so forth, what are all the links and handles you'd like people to walk away with?
Super. So it's simply MycoMeditations.com. Myco spelled MYCO. We've had quite a bit of good quality press, mainstream press written about us in the last few years. So enter that into Google. There'll be a wealth of information that's replicated on our website as well, with links to research and how we operate. So I guess the main source is MycoMeditations.com, and we welcome any inquiries, both from people interested in coming on retreats, as well as those therapists or practitioners interested in coming to Jamaica and learning to work with psilocybin with us.
Excellent. I'll make sure those links are contained in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com, or if you have a good memory, you could just punch MycoMeditations.com, you said, into your URL right away. Again, Justin, thank you so much, man. Really appreciated this call today.
Thanks, James. I appreciate you too. Thanks for a great interview.
And cut. Okay, that was Justin Townsend. A long interview, one that I enjoyed. Like I said, very turned on, but not, and I hope you enjoyed it. I am happy to have featured Justin on this. It was a very interesting thing because I often get these emails from podcast booking companies being like, we have the perfect guest for your show. Like 99.9% of the time, I'm like, no, you actually don't. And a lot of the times I get the sense that I'm being reached out to more so to use my platform as a commercial, like a really long commercial, than as a opportunity to offer some unique and interesting and valuable information or content into the scene. And I was really pleasantly surprised to find out in my prep call with Justin that that it seemed like he had such cool and interesting and I think valuable things to offer into the discussion space. And so anyways, that's an aside. I really enjoyed my conversation with him, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, this show is brought to you by people like you on Patreon. And if you're finding value in the show, I would appreciate you reciprocating that value in the form of some sort of financial contribution. Becoming a patron is great because it's basically you saying, hey, I like what you do. Here's a tip in advance for doing it. And that platform enables me to do this work as my full-time work while earning an income. And that means a lot to me. So if you're enjoying the show, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast here. And if you can't become a patron, that's fine. You can do a one-off donation through PayPal, or if cryptocurrency is still a thing, you could do it there. But if you're not with the financial capacity to do so, don't worry about it. Just continue to enjoy the show. Those who contribute financially and are able to contribute financially help support this podcast not being behind a paywall or being behind an invisible paywall, wherein the actual genuine, authentic content is behind the manipulations of what ad companies require in order to give that podcast their funding. So yeah, thanks for becoming a patron or supporting the show financially if you can. And if not, don't worry about it. You can follow me on all the social medias. Best to follow me on my newsletter. I send out a monthly digest. That's also linked. And that's all. This was the first podcast episode of 2023. I hope you rang in that Gregorian reset or like a tick up in number with enthusiasm, joy, and connection. And if not, I hope that 2023 at least offers you a couple of moments such as that throughout the course of its time. And that's all. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the podcast, especially all the way to the end. It was a very long episode, and I am, at this point, maybe rambling on. So I'll end it here. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next episode of Adventures of the Mind. And until then, take care.